Nora stood in the crowded waiting room of the free clinic on 14th and Elm, $287 left in her checking account. An eviction notice crumpled in her coat pocket. Her 9-year-old daughter Lily lay 2 floors up, oxygen mask fogging with every shallow breath. The rare neurological disorder demanding $9,400 in surgery by the end of the week, or the doctors would not guarantee another. The double doors burst open. Victor Voss stormed in wearing a charcoal Brioni suit cut like a blade, $68,000 Patek Philippe flashing under the fluorescent lights. His eyes swept the room, landed on Nora's threadbare jacket and the cardboard box of Lily's clothes at her feet. He pointed one manicured finger. "This isn't a charity drop-off. Take your sob story and your cardboard box and get out." The waiting room went dead quiet. 23 people heard every word. A toddler started crying. Nora's face burned hot as she bent, lifted the box, and walked out without a sound. Victor had no idea the exhausted woman he had just humiliated in front of the entire waiting room was the only person alive who could stop his $47 million waterfront project from collapsing. What secret skill was hiding behind that cardboard box? Nora was 34, a night shift mechanic at McAllister Auto Yard on Industrial Loop. The place smelled of burnt oil and rust at all hours. She wore the same gray coveralls 5 nights a week, sleeves rolled high, hands always carrying the faint black of brake dust no soap could quite remove. After her husband Ryan died in a classified training accident 3 years earlier, she had traded her old life for double shifts and silence. Ryan had been the only one who ever called her Sparks. Most nights she came home at dawn, kissed Lily's forehead while the girl slept, then collapsed on the couch still smelling of transmission fluid. The apartment on 14th and Elm was peeling paint and thin walls, but it was theirs, until the eviction notice slid under the door like a knife. Victor Voss, by contrast, was 41 and moved through the city like he had already bought it. Italian shoes polished to a mirror finish, cufflinks that cost more than Nora's car. He specialized in crushing small businesses to clear ground for luxury waterfront condos. His latest target, the Pier 19 redevelopment, had already displaced 4 family-owned marine shops. The press called him visionary. The people he displaced called him something else. That same night, the power failed at the clinic. At 2:14 a.m., the backup generator coughed once, then died. Alarms screamed down the hallway. Lily's oxygen pump began its dying beep. Nora was the only adult still awake in the basement when the night nurse burst in. "Generators fried. Maintenance won't be here for hours." Nora didn't ask permission. She grabbed her battered canvas bag, the one that still carried a few tools from the yard, and followed the nurse down concrete steps that smelled of mildew and fear. The basement was lit only by a dying emergency bulb. The generator sat cold and silent, a 1970s beast with half its wiring chewed by rats. She pulled a single folded paper napkin from her coat pocket. On it, in Ryan's neat hand, was a faded diagram he had sketched the week before he died. She had carried it every day since, using only the spare wiring she kept in her bag and that napkin as a map. Nora worked in silence. 23 minutes later, she closed the last connection. The generator rumbled back to life. Lights steadied. The alarms fell quiet. Upstairs, Lily's oxygen pump resumed its soft, steady rhythm. The night nurse stared at her. "How did you?" Nora wiped her hands on the same napkin, refolded it carefully, and slid it back into her pocket. "Old habit," she said, voice low. "Don't tell anyone." The nurse nodded once. Later that morning, Victor's assistant, a tight-lipped woman named Elena, would learn exactly who had restored power in the basement. She would keep that secret for now. Some debts, she understood, were better left to ripen. 3 days later, an unmarked envelope appeared under the door of Nora's apartment. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a cashier's check for $4,000. The note read only, "Consulting required. Pier 19 electrical grid. 19 days. Cash daily. No names." Nora stood in the dim hallway, Eviction notice still taped to her fridge upstairs. Lily's hospital bracelet still on her wrist. She looked at the folded napkin in her hand, traced Ryan's old lines with one grease-stained thumb. Then she folded the note, slipped it into the same pocket, and made a decision. The grind had just begun. The pier at 4:17 a.m. smelled of brine, diesel, and old rope. Nora arrived on foot, canvas bag slung over one shoulder, the folded napkin tucked against her ribs like a second heartbeat. A man in a yellow hard hat waited under a stuttering sodium lamp. He didn't offer a name. He simply handed her a metal clipboard and a prepaid debit card loaded with $200 in crisp 20s. "Grid's been dropping phases since the storm," he said. "Union says it's unfixable without a full shutdown. Boss wants it live by sunrise tomorrow." Nora scanned the schematics. They were sloppy, half-erased, the kind of work that got men killed on offshore rigs. She said nothing, just nodded once and walked the catwalk alone. By 6:42 a.m., she had isolated 3 corroded bus bars no one else had noticed. The first phase stabilized with a low, satisfied hum that rolled across the water like distant thunder. The hard hat man returned, eyes wider this time. He watched her rear out a failing transformer using only a Leatherman and a length of 4-0 cable she'd salvaged from a dumpster 2 piers over. When the meters finally steadied at perfect 60 hertz, he exhaled like a man who'd just seen a miracle. "Lady, you're either a witch or you used to do this for a living." Nora wiped her palms on the napkin, refolded its worn creases, and said, "Just here for the cash." She collected her daily envelope at shift's end, 4 crisp hundreds, and walked home before the morning crew arrived. Lily's new night nurse, a quiet woman named Grace, had left a note on the kitchen table. "Vitals stable, smiled twice today." Nora pinned the note beside the eviction warning and allowed herself one small luxury: 2 spoonfuls of peanut butter eaten straight from the jar while she stared at Ryan's diagram until the paper softened under her thumbs. That pattern repeated for 9 straight days. Different pier, different crisis, same unmarked envelope. A cracked substation relay at Pier 14. A saltwater-flooded PLC cabinet at Pier 27 that had every licensed engineer throwing up their hands. Each time Nora arrived before dawn, solved what they said couldn't be solved, wiped her hands on the same napkin, and vanished before the union whistles blew. On day 10, the mini-crisis arrived without warning. She was halfway through recalibrating a 480-volt panel at Pier 19 when the main breaker tripped with a gunshot bang. Sparks showered across her forearms. The backup generator she had quietly coaxed back to life 3 nights earlier suddenly screamed into overload. Alarms howled across the entire dock. 2 longshoremen sprinted toward her, flashlights cutting the dark. One of them, big, tattooed, with a voice like gravel, recognized the signature flicker of the overload. "That panel's been red-tagged for 6 months. Who the hell are you?" Nora didn't flinch. She killed the main bus with an insulated screwdriver, reached into the live cabinet, and felt for the exact lug Ryan had taught her to trust on their last deployment together. Her fingers found the loose crimp. The smell of ozone and hot copper filled the air. 38 seconds later, the entire pier's power smoothed out again, steady as a metronome. The tattooed man lowered his flashlight. His partner whispered, "That's the same fix the old chief used to do on the carrier deck. Call sign Reaper back in '08. Nobody's touched a panel like that since he rotated out." Nora's stomach tightened, but she kept her face blank. The name Reaper had not been spoken near her in 11 years. She wiped sweat from her brow with the napkin, refolded Ryan's faded lines, and slid it deep into her coat before either man could see the tremor in her hand. The tattooed longshoreman stepped closer. "Ma'am, you got any idea how many guys owe their lives to the way that man used to patch a grid under fire? If you're half of what I think you are, you don't belong crawling around these piers for pocket change." Nora met his eyes for the first time. "I belong exactly where I am. Keep it quiet." She collected her envelope at the usual drop box and walked the 3 miles back to the apartment through a cold drizzle that tasted of salt and regret. When she opened the door, Lily was sitting up in the rented hospital bed for the first time in weeks. The little girl's thin fingers clutched the corner of her blanket, and her oxygen cannula fogged with each careful breath. "Mommy," Grace said, "you fixed the lights again. Did you bring me anything shiny from the water?" Nora set the debit card on the nightstand, then pulled the folded napkin from her pocket. She opened it carefully on the blanket so Lily could trace the old pencil lines the way she used to trace her father's dog tags. "Not shiny," Nora said softly, "but important. Same as always." Lily smiled the small, tired smile that still managed to crack Nora's chest wide open. Grace watched from the doorway, saying nothing, but her eyes lingered on the napkin with new understanding. The next morning, Elena waited on the pier instead of the usual hard hat courier. She wore a charcoal pencil skirt and heels that cost more than Nora's rent, yet her posture carried the rigid caution of someone balancing on a blade. "Mr. Voss wants to meet the consultant who's been keeping his ports alive," Elena said without greeting. "Tonight, 8 sharp, the boardroom at the main terminal. He thinks it's time names were attached to results." Nora felt the weight of the napkin against her ribs. She thought of the red-tagged panel, the whispered call sign, the way Lily had traced her father's diagram with fragile fingers only hours earlier. The grind was sharpening now, turning from shadow work into something that could no longer hide. She looked at Elena and spoke the first words she had offered any of Victor Voss's people in weeks. "Tell him I'll be there, but I choose the lighting." Elena's perfectly lined brows rose a fraction. She nodded once, the way the night nurse had nodded in the basement, and walked away across rain-slick concrete that reflected the harbor lights like scattered coins. Nora stayed on the pier until the gulls began their morning quarrel. She pulled the napkin out again, studied Ryan's careful handwriting in the gray dawn, and felt the slow leak of her old life widening into a crack she could no longer seal. The debt was ripening faster than even Elena had expected. And somewhere in the city, Victor Voss was about to sit across a polished table from a woman whose signature on a decommissioned flight log still read Lieutenant Nora M. Hale, Reaper 6, 287 combat missions. Callsign earned the night she rewired a carrier's entire electrical grid while taking indirect fire off the coast of Yemen. He just didn't know it yet. Nora arrived at the main terminal at 7:51. The boardroom lights had been dimmed to a single overhead bank. The rest left dark the way she'd requested. Shadows pooled in the corners like old engine oil. She wore the same oil-stained coveralls, the same scuffed boots, but the folded napkin rested inside the left breast pocket, pressed flat against the dog tags that had once belonged to her father. Their metal edges dug in with every breath. A reminder, promise. Victor Voss entered at 8 exactly. Italian loafers clicked across marble. Brioni suit cut sharp enough to draw blood. A Patek Philippe glinted at his wrist, catching the low light like a warning. Elena followed 2 steps behind, tablet in hand, her earlier poise now edged with something closer to unease. Voss stopped at the head of the long table. His eyes swept over Nora once, twice. "So you're the miracle worker hiding in my motor pool," he said, voice smooth as wet concrete. The one turning red ink black. Impressive. For a janitor. He gestured at the single chair opposite him. Nora sat. She said nothing. Voss leaned forward, fingertips steepled. The scent of his cologne, something expensive, cedar and smoke, cut through the faint brine drifting in from the open window. "I've reviewed the reports. 43% efficiency gain in 9 weeks. Cargo throughput up 21%. Insurance premiums down. All while my own engineers couldn't find the fault in panel 47. Care to explain how a woman who sweeps floors managed that?" Nora's hand drifted to her pocket. The napkin crinkled softly. Ryan's handwriting. The same handwriting that had once scribbled fuel calculations on the back of a ration card at 31,000 feet. "I fixed what was broken," she said quietly. Voss smiled, the kind of smile men wear when they think they're about to win. Name's Ms. Hale. The word dropped between them like a wrench on concrete. Elena's stylus froze mid-tap. Voss's smile faltered half a millimeter. Hale. As in? As in the consultant you hired through 3 shell companies because your own people kept quitting. She met his eyes. The one who told your night shift to reroute the main bus at 2:14 a.m. last Thursday. Invoice number 4471. A long silence stretched. Somewhere down the hall, a forklift beeped in reverse. Voss tapped a manicured nail on the table. Fine. You want credit. You'll get it. But I need to know how deep this goes. My board is breathing down my neck. They think I've got a ghost in the machine. Nora allowed herself one small breath. The dog tags shifted against her sternum. She reached into the other pocket and slid a single sheet across the table. A faded schematic. Panel 47. Voss laughed once, short and disbelieving. You expect me to let a motor pool mechanic walk onto my flagship dock and... 42 now, Nora said. She was already moving toward the door. The man in the windbreaker stepped into her path. Ma'am, with respect, this is a $12 million automated crane. One wrong move and we're looking at... Nora stopped. She looked past him, straight at Voss. Tell them to clear the catwalk. And kill the master breaker. All of it. Elena's eyes widened. That will shut down the entire terminal. Yes, Nora said. It will. Voss studied her for 3 full seconds. Something in her face, maybe the way her left hand kept brushing that pocket, made him nod once. Do it. The next 20 minutes were a blur of running footsteps and radio chatter. Nora moved through the terminal like a shadow that had finally remembered its shape. She climbed the external ladder of the massive crane, boots ringing on steel. The wind off the harbor smelled of salt and diesel. Below, dockworkers stood in uneasy clusters, hard hats glowing orange under sodium lights. She reached the control pod. The panel inside was a nest of warning lights and frozen diagnostics. Nora pulled the napkin from her pocket, unfolded it on the console. Ryan's handwriting stared back at her. Numbers, vectors, the same sequence she had used the night her squadron lost power over the Gulf of Aden. 287 missions. One of them had ended with her rewiring a carrier while tracers stitched the sky. She began to work. Fingers that had once hot-wired million-dollar fighters now traced the same paths through proprietary code. The dog tags swung free from her neck, clinking softly against the metal housing. A tactile metronome. At minute 31, the first green light flickered on. At minute 37, the crane gave a deep hydraulic sigh and rotated 3 degrees west. At minute 41, the entire dock lighting rig surged back to full brightness. Horns blared. Containers began their slow, obedient march toward the waiting ship. Down on the ground, Victor Voss stood beside Elena, arms crossed so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The 2 board members watched in stunned silence. The windbreaker man was on his sat phone, voice rising in disbelief. Nora descended the ladder. Her coveralls were streaked with fresh grease. The napkin was back in her pocket, now smudged with a new thumbprint. She stopped 10 feet from Voss. The symbolic weight of the folded paper pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat. "You're welcome," she said. Voss opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time, the polished CEO looked small. Before he could speak, a small voice cut through the night. "Mom!" Lily stood at the edge of the security gate, pajama pants visible beneath her coat. Grace held her hand, looking equal parts exhausted and proud. The girl clutched a crumpled piece of paper, another napkin, this one covered in crayon drawings of airplanes and stick-figure cranes. Nora's chest cracked open again. She crossed the distance in 6 strides and dropped to one knee. Lily ran into her arms. The scent of strawberry shampoo cut through the diesel like grace itself. Voss watched the reunion. His Italian shoes shifted on the concrete. The Patek suddenly looked very heavy on his wrist. He took one step forward. "Lieutenant Hale," he said quietly, using the rank for the first time. I think I owe you more than a consulting fee." Nora looked up at him over her daughter's shoulder. The dog tags caught the harbor light, dull but unmistakable. "Not yet," she said. "The night's still young." Behind them, the crane lifted another container, smooth as silk. The debt had just grown another precise notch. And Victor Voss, for the first time in his polished life, felt the ground tilt beneath his $4,000 shoes. He didn't know the full weight of what was coming. But the crack in Nora's secrecy had just become a fissure. And the napkin in her pocket, now carrying both her husband's ink and her daughter's crayons, felt heavier than ever. The next morning, the boardroom on the 23rd floor of Voss Global smelled of fresh espresso and fear. Sunlight sliced through the floor-to-ceiling glass, catching every speck of dust that dared float near the long mahogany table. 11 directors sat in their assigned seats, ties knotted tight, legal pads untouched. Victor Voss occupied the head, Brioni suit pressed to razor edges. Yet the collar of his white shirt looked one size too large today. The Patek on his wrist ticked louder than the air conditioning. Nora entered at 8:47 exactly. Same coveralls, now washed but still carrying the faint scent of hydraulic fluid and yesterday's victory. The folded napkin rested in the left breast pocket like a hidden commendation. She carried no briefcase, only a single thumb drive the size of a dog tag. Voss cleared his throat. "Lieutenant, Ms. Hale has asked for 10 minutes. I've granted it." Murmurs rippled. Elena leaned forward, manicured nails tapping once against the table's edge. "This is highly irregular, Victor." Nora didn't wait for permission. She plugged the drive into the projector. The screen bloomed with schematics, timestamps, and cold numbers. Invoice number 4471. Mission logs from 287 sorties over the Hindu Kush. Maintenance records dated back 11 years showing where Voss Global's own engineers had cut corners on the very cranes now rusting at Pier 19. Each slide landed like a hammer on glass. At slide 17 the room went still. A quiet voice, Nora's, cut through the silence. 17 million in unreported safety violations. For near misses in the last 14 months alone. And every single one signed off by the man sitting at the head of this table. Voss's face drained of color. The Italian shoes tapped once under the table, then stopped. She clicked to the final slide. A single line of text appeared in stark white on black. Owner of record, Hale Recovery and Salvage LLC. Acquired via quiet title, 2:14 a.m. this morning. Gasps traveled the length of the table like a wave. Elena's pen rolled off her legal pad and clattered to the floor. Nora spoke again, voice level, almost gentle. "While you were busy firing the only person who understood these machines, I bought the debt. Every lien, every overlooked invoice. The Port Authority was grateful. Turns out when a decorated Navy lieutenant commander shows them proof that your equipment nearly killed 2 longshoremen last spring, they tend to listen." She let the silence stretch. The projector fan hummed. Someone's chair creaked. Voss stared at the screen as if it had personally betrayed him. Then slowly he rose. The movement cost him. His shoulders, usually squared with inherited confidence, now carried the invisible weight of every dismissive word he'd ever spoken to the woman in grease-stained coveralls. "Directors," he began, voice fraying at the edges. I was wrong." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Elena's mouth opened, closed. No one else moved. Voss turned to Nora. His eyes, for once, held no calculation, only recognition. "Lieutenant Commander Hale, I treated you like scrap. I called your record fiction, your recommendations overreach. I told the entire executive floor you were just another single mother playing mechanic." His voice cracked on the last word. "I was arrogant, blind, and I nearly cost this company everything that still matters." He walked around the table until only 3 feet of polished wood separated them. The Patek caught the light, but it no longer looked like armor. I apologize. Privately. Here. Now. You saved lives last night. You saved this company this morning. And I repaid you with contempt. The boardroom had never been so quiet. Even the harbor traffic outside seemed to hold its breath. Nora studied him for a long second. The napkin in her pocket felt warm against her ribs. She gave the smallest nod. Voss turned to the directors, shoulders squared in an entirely new way. Effective immediately, I am stepping down as CEO. I will remain as an advisor only if Lieutenant Commander Hale approves. Every future contract goes through her desk first. And I will personally appear before the Port Safety Board this afternoon to accept full responsibility for the violations. He looked back at Nora, eyes steady. If she'll have me. For the first time that morning, Nora smiled. Small, tired, real. The vindication wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in the trembling signature Voss placed on the transfer documents 10 minutes later. It lived in the way Elena quietly slid her resignation across the table without being asked. It lived in the sound of 11 directors rising to their feet. Not for Voss, but for the woman who had just rewritten the name on the building in invisible ink. 2 weeks later, the harbor smelled of salt and fresh paint. Crane 17 stood gleaming under the morning sun, its massive arms stenciled in crisp white. Hale 17. Workers in new safety vests moved with purpose. The old rust was gone. The new respect remained. Nora stood on the observation platform with Lily beside her. The girl clutched the second napkin, the one covered in crayon airplanes, now sealed in a small plastic sleeve. Nora's own napkin rested inside a shadow box on the wall of her new office. Husband's ink and daughter's crayons side by side like twin medals. Victor Voss approached from the stairwell. No Brioni today, just a simple navy jacket and jeans that looked like they had seen honest work. The Patek was gone. A plain Timex sat in its place. He stopped 6 feet away, respectful distance. The board voted this morning. Unanimous. They want the building renamed. Hale Tower has a certain ring to it. Nora raised an eyebrow. Bit dramatic. Fitting, he said. Then softer. I meant what I said in that room. I'm still learning how to be useful. If you'll let me. Lily looked up at the tall man, then at her mother. She held out the crayon napkin like an offering. Voss took it with both hands, as carefully as if it were a live fuse. Nora watched the exchange. The wind moved across the water, carrying the faint metallic tang of new welding. For the first time in years, the weight in her chest felt bearable, shared. Later that evening, she sat on the porch of the small house they'd bought near the pier. Lily slept inside, dog tags resting on the nightstand like a promise kept. Nora unfolded the original napkin one last time. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear. She traced them with a calloused finger, then folded it again and slipped it back into her pocket. Some debts aren't paid in money or titles. They're paid in the slow, stubborn decision to become better than the worst thing you ever did to someone else. Victor Voss was still paying. Nora was still teaching him how. And in the quiet harbors of the world, where cranes still lift impossible weights against the sky, the lesson echoed. Never mistake grease for weakness, or a quiet parent for a small one. The people who keep the machines running are often the ones who remember how to fly them. The napkin, now sealed behind glass in the lobby of what used to be Voss Global, caught the security lights each night like a quiet heartbeat. 2 generations of ink. One unbreakable promise. That was enough.